Good morning, everyone. My name is Neera Tandon, and I am president of the Center for American Progress. On behalf of CAP and our great partners at Planned Parenthood Global, I want to welcome all of you to this very important event. Today, we are commemorating International Women's Day when communities around the world come together to recognize and honor activists who fought and continue to fight for women's equality. While much has been achieved since the first International Women's Day in 1911, there is still so much work to be done. Some of the biggest global challenges we face continue to fall most heavily on women and girls, from rising global conflict and violence, to displaced populations and refugee flows, to massive economic inequalities that harm working families. Centering women and girls in our attempts to tackle these challenges, what we might call a feminist foreign policy, is critical to ensuring that no one is left behind. That is especially true as we work to address the threat posed by climate change. Climate change represents one of the most complex challenges facing the global community today. The question is no longer why or if climate change is happening. We are already feeling the impacts today in the forms of stronger storms, increased and more severe wildfires, flooding, and rising sea levels. Today, the question is, how do we move forward to build a 100% clean future, create good-paying jobs, and safeguard human health, safety, and freedom for everyone? As a result of gender inequality and barriers to reproductive justice and bodily autonomy, women around the world, particularly women of color, low-income women, and women in the global south, will face greater challenges in responding and adapting to the impacts of climate change. During and after a natural disaster, women often have trouble accessing medical care, face increased threats of sexual violence, have slower economic recovery compared to men, and generally experience poor reproductive and maternal health outcomes. These challenges reaffirm the centrality of the UN Sustainable Development Goals as a key organizing framework to address the challenges and promote gender equality, good health and well-being, peace and justice, and climate action. Women are also best positioned to tackle climate change with their families and the communities and through political action. In fact, research has shown that countries with more women in political leadership tend to have lower carbon dioxide emissions. It is paramount that women are given a seat at key decision-making tables so the world may benefit from their knowledge, resilience, and power. Thankfully, there are countless women who are fighting to make sure that happens. There are also many young leaders, like Ugandan youth climate activist Vanessa Nakate, who are leading the global resistance at the local, national, and international levels. We are honored to have her with us today. We're also grateful to be joined by a panel of inspiring women of color from the worlds of policy and advocacy, and I can't wait to hear about their experiences and insights. Now I have the great pleasure of turning the program over to Asab Ahmed, Senior Policy Analyst on CAP's Women's Initiative, who will moderate today's conversation. Asab? Oh, come on up.
So much, Neera. Hello and welcome everyone to the Center for American Progress and to this special event, The Power of Women, Intersections in the Global Climate and Reproductive Rights Movement. We are hosting this event, as Neera said, in celebration of International Women's Day. We also would like to thank Planned Parenthood Global for co-sponsoring this event with us. Today we want to explore the effects of climate change on women's rights and bodily autonomy, as well as the importance of women's empowerment and leadership in combating climate change. We're delighted to kick off this conversation with Vanessa Nakate. Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you for having me.
So Vanessa is a climate activist hailing from Kampala, Uganda, who has used her platform to raise awareness about the dangers of climate change in her country. She was the first Fridays for Future activist in Uganda, out of which she founded Youth for Future Africa. She also founded the Rise Up movement, which has inspired numerous affiliated climate strikes throughout Africa, as well as the Save Congo campaign, which raises awareness about deforestation and wildfires in the Congo Basin. Vanessa has spoken at conferences and world gatherings to continue to call attention to the impacts of climate change on the African continent, including at the World Economic Forum in Davos and COP25 in Madrid. So, Vanessa, to begin, can you tell us what drew you to climate activism? How did you get started?
Becoming a climate activist was a process for me. It was around May in 2018. I wanted to do something that could cause change in the lives of the people in my country. My father is a Rotarian, and I've grown up seeing him take part in activities where they help people, for example, provide them with health facilities for free, or education facilities for children who don't have the ability to go to school. So I also wanted to do something in that line. Therefore, I started carrying out research to understand the problems that people face in my community and in my country at large. But I was really surprised to find climate change as one of those problems, because I've been in school, and it is taught as something that either happened in the past or something that's coming in the far future, and we really don't have to worry about it. So I was moved to read more about it to understand its causes and its impacts. When I saw the causes and the impacts, I realized that there are people who are actually looking at climate change in the face right now. For example, in my country, there is a region called the Mount Elgon area. They have suffered numerous floods and landslides. And when I saw all that, I knew that I had to do something about it. I didn't have any resources or anything, but I believed that I would use my voice to try and create awareness, because if I, who had been at school, hadn't even known that climate change is real and it's here right now, what about the average person who hasn't had the opportunity to be in school? Yeah.
So out of that, and out of your passion for activism, you created the Rise Up movement, and as well as the Save Congo campaign. Can you tell us a little bit more about that work?
About the Save Congo, I chose to call it the Save Congo Rainforest Strike because the Congo rainforest is the largest rainforest in Africa. So it literally represents all the forests in Africa. Most African countries do not have the money for modern solutions to climate change. And they have their hope in the forest, because forests are large carbon sinks for us. So I thought that trying to, create awareness about destruction of these forests and trying to protect them and demand for their, protection from the governments, I thought that it was a way that would help out and try and save the continent and the people whose lives depend on those forests. So I started doing this strike every day. I would call it maybe day 1 strike, Congo Rainforest, day 2. So that's how it attracted more people. I think it attracted people when I reached like day 16. People started joining in, and right now we have so many people striking for the rainforest every day and demanding for its protection. Then for the Rise Up movement, I started it mainly to help amplify the voices of the different African activists. I noticed that in Africa there are quite a number of activists who are doing groundwork, who are doing a lot of things to try and save the planet, to try and create awareness about the destruction of our planet. But then they do not have much coverage, or their voices just stay on the ground. They're not lifted up. So with the Rise Up movement, I wanted to try and show that in Africa, we have people who are fighting for the planet, and they need to be heard. Their stories need to be heard. So many people picked up the initiative, and we have the Rise Up movement in like 10 African countries now. And I believe that with this, it shows that there is a movement in Africa that is also demanding for climate action. Yeah.
Speaking of, having people's voices heard, turning to some recent events coming out of the World Economic Forum in Davos. And for those who don't know, Vanessa had attended a youth climate science event at the World Economic Forum this past January. The Associated Press had taken a photo of the 5 activists that were featured in that event, but in subsequent publication, they cropped Vanessa out of that photo, and she was the only woman of color that was featured. And I wanted to ask, how did that make you feel personally? And what does that say about the climate movement and the way that it's covered by the media?
Yeah, personally, it really made me feel bad. It was a very terrible experience because it wasn't just about me. I thought about the different activists, the different people in my continent who are those who are already facing climate change and suffering the impacts, and those who are trying to have their stories heard, and yet I, who had even got the opportunity to try and give my voice maybe at a world stage, even at that chance, my voice was, erased. So it was really disturbing for me. Uh, Thinking about the people back at home, thinking about my fellow activists and the people at the front line of the climate crisis. And it clearly showed how media has continuously portrayed the climate movement, trying as much as possible to promote white saviorism. And it is something that really needs to change because there are voices in different parts of the world that are demanding for action, and they all deserve to be listened to. Because if we focus on a specific group of people, we won't be able to achieve climate justice, because climate change it's a global issue. It's affecting different people, but then those who are most affected, they're the ones whose voices are being erased. So how shall we be able to achieve climate justice without listening to everyone who is speaking?
Can't agree more. Thank you. In addition to being passionate about representation in the climate movement, you're also very outspoken about the effects of climate change in your country, Uganda. Can you tell us specifically how climate change is affecting the lives of women and girls in your country?
Well, in my country, most people heavily depend on agriculture as a form of survival. So the main effect of climate change would be causing food scarcity in different places of the country. Sorry, and the rural communities. It is the girls and the women who try as much as possible to provide for the families. They're the ones who do the farming, who do the agriculture. So it is quite devastating for them when their produce is affected by maybe flooding or droughts, because we've reached a point whereby the rains are so unpredictable. It is so uneven, and even when it comes in form of torrential rainfall and just causes destruction. So I try to look at the trauma these women and the girls go through when their crops are destroyed and they have to do as much as possible to provide for their families. That's how it is in rural communities. Most men don't have to really do anything. They just have to come back home and the women provide the food. But then where will they get the food after it has been destroyed by climate change? And then most women, when there is a water stress as a result of the droughts, they have to walk very long distances to try as much as possible to get water for their families, water for their children. I would use an example of a photo I saw. This wasn't Uganda, but it was India last year when they had the water stress, and they had a chance to get some water, I think, from a truck, and it was visibly seen that it was the women with jerry cans, with buckets, trying as much as possible to get water. So this is also a challenge. They have to walk very long distances, and then at a very young age, probably 30 something, they start complaining of backaches. But of course, there are people from rural areas, they won't really understand what has caused it. But then those long distances, the intensive agriculture that they carry out. And then recently, that was last year, I read an article that was talking about children brides, and it was talking about how families end up giving up their girl children for marriage to try and reduce on the number of the children at home, especially when they are hit with climate disasters. Most of these families survive on just $1 a day. So if they are hit with climate change disasters, that means they're literally left with nothing and no hope for the future. So they have to try as much as possible to survive. And through their survival, they end up giving up some of their children for marriage. But this never happens to the boys. It happens to the girls. It's the girls who are giving up because the parents get something from maybe the girl's husband to be or something like that. So it's kind of it is so disturbing actually to realize the impacts that climate change really causes on women, specifically on their health, on their livelihoods, and everything they have to endure after these disasters.
Exactly. I mean, climate change will have it'll have exponential effects on women. It's an amplifying sort of factor because, as you said, whether it comes to tending to agriculture, food scarcity, gender-based violence, there are a lot of ways that it manifests. So in terms of what women are doing, and because often, as you alluded to, women are at the front lines, often in the climate change movement, whether it's in their communities or as political leaders. Can you tell us what women are doing in Uganda to combat climate change?
The women that I know, they're fellow activists who are joining the climate activism every week, trying as much as possible to demand for action from the government leaders. And there are those who are leading campaigns of tree planting to try to offset the carbon, to try as much as possible to have a cleaner environment, to have a healthier environment. Because with an unhealthy environment, with pollution, it also affects women in a way, especially pregnant women. They stand high chances of miscarriages with such an environment. So there are women who try as much as possible to plant trees here and there, but of course it's not easy for them. They just do what they're able to do. And those in rural communities, I really can't tell much that they do, but all I can say is that they are the ones who suffer the most, and most of them have no idea about climate change. They don't know what climate change is. I mean, they have not been educated about it. So how will they try and survive from something that they don't even know about?
Can you tell us a bit more about women's education when it comes not only to education around climate change, but education writ large? Because if a woman has additional education, she is better able to she has better economic outcomes and is able to better take care of herself and her family. So could you speak to that?
Yeah, I believe that there is power in educating a woman, because when a woman is educated, they're able to speak up. I believe every woman has a power and a light in them to speak up and cause change in a specific situation or to provide solution to any problem in the world. But the only way that we can activate that power is by educating that woman. Because there are girls who are in the villages, in rural communities. They don't know these things. They have not been exposed. They don't know about visions. They don't know about goals. But the only way that these things can be activated in them is by educating them. Because when you educate a woman, you educate a nation. I believe that every child that a woman gives birth to is a nation. So if you educate that woman, you're educating every nation that she's going to give birth to. Yeah.
Beautifully said. Thank you. So Vanessa, can you tell us what work do you have planned next? What are in the next steps for you?
For now, I'm still doing the activism, of course, the different strikes for the Congo, then the Fridays for Future strikes, and there is this project that I'm running. It's a project where we install solar and institutional stoves in schools to try and provide clean cooking for these children, and also safe cooking for the women who prepare the food, because in most schools it's the women who prepare the food. So with these institutional stoves, they try as much as possible to reduce emissions, so the women are protected from any kind of respiratory problems. And then the solar, it's mainly to help the schools transition to renewable energy, because if we are rooting for renewable energy and people cannot access it or people cannot purchase it, then if we are able to find ways of making it available to people, then that's what we need to do to make it accessible to them. Yeah.
So before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask, do you have any parting words of wisdom for our audience? You've had a lot of them so far, but any other ones?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me and for listening to me. What I would say is that is something that I already said, especially for women. There is power in you to cause a solution to any kind of problem. We have different kinds of problems in the world. People ask themselves, what should I do? And when I look into climate change, I really don't fit there. But you should know that people face different kinds of problems in this world, and every person is in some way connected to a problem. So you can be a solution for any kind of problem. All you have to do is look within yourself and search and understand what people go through and see what you can provide. And you don't need to have resources, you need your voice.
Thank you so much, Vanessa.
Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for enriching conversation. I learned a lot. I'm sure our audience did too. So one more time, let's give a hand to Vanessa Nakate. So if you had any questions for Vanessa, please hold on to them. We're going to be transitioning to our panel conversation, which Vanessa will be joining. The conversation will be moderated by Shilpa Fatki, Vice President of the Women's Initiative. She'll be joined by Carol Agengo of Planned Parenthood Global and Milia Luarki of Indigenous Women Rising. We're going to do a quick stage change, and then we'll get the conversation started. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Vanessa. That was wonderful. And thank you so much for joining us today to celebrate International Women's Day. We're really thrilled to have this conversation and excited to dig in. So we heard a lot from Vanessa. She's joined today on this stage with Carol Agengo. Carol is the Associate Regional Director of Policy and Advocacy at Planned Parenthood Global, a passionate human rights lawyer and advocate. And before this, she was working in different countries at the Open Society Foundation for legal reform for women's rights in 16 countries across the continent. So thank you for being here, Carol. And excited also to have Milia Luarki here with us, co-founder of Indigenous Women Rising, a nonprofit based in New Mexico that's committed to honoring Native and Indigenous peoples' right to equitable and culturally safe health options. Milia is an organizer, a birth doula, a breastfeeding advocate, and has always had a passion for giving back to her community. So welcome, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So I really wanted to just start off by learning a little bit more about the work that you all do in your organizations, and then we'll go from there. So Carol, can you just tell us a little bit more about what your day-to-day is like and how these issues of climate change and women's health and rights sort of intersect?
Thank you. At Planned Parenthood Global, we work to promote and protect the sexual and reproductive health and rights of women, including the right to safe abortion. And we work in Africa, we work in 4 countries, in Kenya, Uganda, Burkina Faso, and Senegal. Our focus is on young people because they're the most affected in terms of access to reproductive health rights or even information, right from the challenges that arise with the restrictions around comprehensive sexuality education, which should be the basis of information for every child. And so we see the intersection playing out because when there's a shift in focus for any reason, in any way, in any country, then what suffers most is the health budgets, and of course the reproductive health budgets suffer as a consequence. And even though we're not working directly on climate change, then we see the shifts in climate changes affecting how women are responding to some of the issues that come as a consequence of climate change, and how this, by consequence, affects their reproductive health choices. So to give a quick example, the climate change is how it manifests is in the weather patterns. And in Kenya, for example, the short rains and the long rains, which are the mainstay of the agricultural economy in Kenya, are no longer predictable. And as a result, then women have to resort to other forms of economic activity, because women, and Vanessa spoke to that, are the ones who hold the the agricultural economy or economies of our countries. And so when the rains fail, they have to resort to other ways of finding economic sustenance. They come to the urban areas and they end up in the slums, which have a lot of insecurity, which exposes them to rape and other forms of violence. And the consequence of that is unwanted pregnancies, sexually transmitted diseases, and of course, ultimately, unwanted abortions. And the rural-urban migration we see that women bear the brunt of it. They come to the rural areas, the urban areas, to seek employment, or even if they stay in the rural areas, their husbands come and their partners come to the city. They do not have the means to sustain the agricultural economy back home, and the consequences are telling. And so minimizing access to these resources then means that the access to the health budgets, like I said, are reduced. So they're not even able to get the commodities back in the rural villages or even in the slum areas. So it's a whole integrated and interconnected web of issues where women's reproductive health stands at the core.
That's great. Vanessa, does that ring true to you in sort of hearing Carol's understanding of what's happening on the ground? I wanted to learn a little bit more about some of the initiatives that you're doing on the ground, Carol, and different programs that you're working on, and what can we do to ensure that women's bodily autonomy is really at the forefront of leaders' minds when they're addressing some of these issues?
Okay, thank you. I'm here with a colleague and a partner, Nelly. I don't know where she's seated in the audience. Yes, and Nelly works for an organization called Reproductive Health Network, which was founded by Planned Parenthood Global in 2010. And one of the things that they're doing is working with young people in communities, in rural communities. So I'll give an example of a community they work in, which is called Kilifi. And this is a coastal town. Poverty levels are extremely high. Incidences of child marriage are also very high. And by consequence, we have a lot of young girls dropping out of school, teenage pregnancies, or child marriages, early and child marriages, forced marriages. And so we've got a whole problem of reproductive health that is playing out. And because we have a central, a devolved government, the health function has not been fully devolved. And so we do not have adequate facilities in the rural areas. Coupled with this, we do not have comprehensive sexuality education. And so the girls are basically struggling on their own, and women are justifying marrying off their young girls because of something that Vanessa also alluded to. They don't have the means. So an easy thing is to marry off your young girl so that you then reduce the economic burden on yourself. So what RHN is doing with this community is, one, creating awareness, but also building up the capacity for these girls to be able to recognize the need for their bodily autonomy and be able to demand for services from where they sit, rather than having this come from the outside in. And we see a lot of changes in terms of how the young girls and the young people are expressing themselves and actually demanding for information and youth-friendly reproductive health services.
Get Malia into the conversation. Tell us a little bit more about the work that you're doing at Indigenous Women's Rising, and sort of how do you connect for yourself and for your community these issues of climate change, climate justice, and reproductive rights and reproductive justice?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me and the ladies here this morning. But just kind of how the two intersect in my community. I can't really speak for other Native reservations, but for mine, it's the same, crisis, or the climate crisis and reproductive justice is all one. The way we view our whole being is through the land, and because it is being challenged right now, we are also being challenged, and it's very hard when your community doesn't quite understand that, and trying to figure out how to not only educate them but continuously educate ourselves, and finding ways to also get them involved as well. So
all of you have talked about the power of young people in this movement. I really want to sort of ask more about that. What is it, how is advocacy, Carol, from your perspective, maybe changing with young people? And for those of us on the panel that are slightly younger, what does that feel like to you on the ground, and how does the work change or differ when young folks are really driving the movement?
I think we cannot underestimate or ignore the power of young people, and especially in this digital age, because they're able to move a lot of, or create a lot of force, even without moving from where they are. So right from your parents' house, in your parents' living room, you can actually create a lot of traction using especially social media. And I think harnessing that power amongst young people is critical. And at Planned Parenthood Global, in the Africa Regional Office, we're working with young people through a youth empowerment program, where we have a program called the Billy Now, where we hope to create a movement of 1 billion young people who are demanding and accessing their reproductive health rights now. And they're using digital technology to create demand, but also get referrals to services, and are able to access services that are conducive to them as young people. And also with the reproductive health network that I mentioned, and I hope Nelly will get a chance to speak about that. They have discussions. Yesterday, as we were traveling across from Kenya, Nelly was coordinating a tweetathon. Yes, as we were traveling, and they were having a discussion on reproductive health for young people. So I think that's what we have to harness as reproductive health advocates, so that the youth are able to get information that they need, but most importantly, to get access to services. Because the other challenge is, once they have awareness has been created, they have to have access to those services. So that's an important thing. And I think at Planned Parenthood Global, we are fully harnessing the power of the youth and using the resources that are available to the youth for their own, for the advancement of their reproductive rights.
Yeah, I think about that. What the youth really need is the information. Once you give them the information and they understand how the situation affects them and their future, they will demand for the change. That's how powerful they are.
And just kind of to piggyback off of her answer, young people are proving themselves every single day. And just like Vanessa said, if we give them the education, the tools, the resources to do what needs to be done, or just let them know what is going to happen in the future, they will instantly, and speaking from experience, because I do that every single day, they will get involved. And they will demand the needs for their futures and their current lives today.
Leah, tell us a little bit more about the role of Indigenous women in sort of making sure some of these efforts are sustainable, responsible, and a little bit more about the work of your organization.
Well, I acknowledge and we acknowledge the work being done, and I'm sorry if I butcher this, the name of the reservation, but the Wet'suwet'en territory along the Canadian border, or I guess by the Canadian border, the Canadian government is actively violating their own laws and exposing Indigenous people at the cost of it. And we also know because of an iconic Indigenous woman by the name of Winona LaDuke, who is part of the Ojibwe nation, the states have a long history of enforcing military forces to not only control but exploit and extract resources from the land. And for an example, in the pueblo that I grew up in Laguna, we have the Jack Pile uranium mine, which has caused so much harm to Pueblo people. And then not to only mention that the environmental racism going on with the different pipelines. In a predominantly white neighborhood, they wouldn't want pipelines going up in their backyards or drinking contaminated water, so why would we? But as tradition, we continue to remind ourselves every single day that we are not owners of the land. We are only stewards. We're put on this earth to take care of our land, to take care of each other, and continuously putting ourselves in harm's way to ensure that not only do we have clean air and water, food, but also making sure that we continue to do that and educate our people to also understand that as well.
So we were disappointed that Jade Sasser wasn't able to join us today, and she has this great book, which I wanted to highlight, On Infertile Ground. And I wanted to read a passage. The book really centers the role of issues around population control and women's rights and climate change. So I'm just going to read this so we can bring her here in spirit. Sexual stewardship rests on instrumental approaches, sometimes using technical solutions, like contraceptives, to address the complex social, political, and economic drivers of population growth, and to build the base of science and activism to support international family planning policy. When women's fertility and reproduction is lifted out of the social context of entrenched poverty, gender inequality, growing wealth and income inequality, inadequate access to comprehensive health care, educational services, employment opportunities, and cultural norms favoring large families, it's easy to imagine women as freely acting, autonomous agents whose enduring high fertility is individually driven. Sometimes in development circles, this model is an attractive way to build a base of new advocates, specifically young environmental activists, as well as to maintain support for those who might otherwise have long abandoned the issue of population. And she goes on to talk a little bit about language and this focus on women's right and empowerment, and really tries to bring to light some of the issues that we've been talking about, or folks in the climate movement talk about at the intersection of women's health and rights and reproductive rights and justice. I'm just really interested, Carol, in your perspective on that, knowing that there has been over many years a long history of population control, a very sordid American history of sterilization and coercion among women of color, but specifically Black women. Just wanted to hear how you are hearing that sort of concept at all, and just want to get your reactions.
I think I'll start by saying that any form of control is potentially dangerous, and it breeds resistance because control equals resistance. So there's no way we can be speaking reproductive justice if it is underpinned on issues of control, because reproductive justice presupposes a level of autonomy. You cannot have autonomy when you have control. So I think that that is my point of departure. And if you look at population control policies, a lot of them are very narrow and extremely parochial in nature, and they do not get to the desired results. And so the alternative is to have policies that, one, are informed by the realities of the people for whom they're intended. And therefore, there has to be a level of participation, and the policies cannot be so narrow as to address an issue as fundamental as reproductive health in a narrow and siloed way, because reproductive health goes to the root. It's the core of society. Any society that does not respect the reproductive health of its citizens, the reproductive rights of its citizens, is actually setting itself up for failure, because we know that women form more than half the world's population, and you cannot be making policies that do not take into account the needs and the realities of half of the world's population. And so there has to be a level of consultation. There also has to be integration, so that you're looking at, we've just been discussing, and earlier on we had Vanessa speak about the climate change initiatives that she's working on. And we cannot divorce reproductive health from the reality, the economic, the political, and the cultural realities that define women's being as such. And also we need to make the climate change a reality by having, bringing in the aspects of climate change in the policies that define reproductive health, so that when we're speaking about budgets, for example, we're taking into account the budgets, reproductive health budgets of nations that take into account the climate change disasters that are caused by the floods. Accessing reproductive health in a humanitarian setting is different from accessing it in peacetime. And so there has to be that has to be taken into consideration. We also have to take into consideration the consequences of some of the resource-based conflicts, where women bear the brunt of those conflicts, and the root causes of those resource-based conflicts you find has to do with the environment and climate change. Because if there's maybe say mineral wealth, for example, there'll be conflict around control of that mineral wealth. And who bears the consequence? Who bears the brunt of that conflict? It's the women. They're the ones who become easy pawns because of the insecurity that is caused, and the rape and sexual violence that we had spoken about earlier. And so we cannot talk control, population control. We must speak about reproductive justice, but from a broad perspective and not the siloed perspective in which it is addressed.
Either of you want to add into that at all?
Yeah, just to add on that, I think we should push for policies that involve climate justice and reproductive health, because the only way that we can fight climate change is by involving women. So I believe that there are probably countries or governments that have come up with solutions like population control as a way of fighting climate change. But I believe that of course affects reproductive health, but then it's also not the way that we can fight climate change. We need to look at we need to push these governments to look at the core things that they need to do. That is by holding those accountable and taking decisions that are uncomfortable for them in order to address the issue of climate change while respecting reproductive health. Because if we are to solve climate change, if we are to push for social justice and reproductive justice, we need to involve the women. They need to understand how women are affected by whatever decisions that they come up with, for example, population control decisions, then I think we also need to push them to raise economic status of women, because most of these women suffer a lot after these climate disasters, because they don't have any form of restoration, or they don't have any money maybe to access some of the services that they need, for example, menstrual services, or generally all health services. So as we push for the economic status of women to be raised, so that they can be able to overcome and to be able to adapt, or to to have a way of survival after these climate disasters, we also need to push the issue of reproductive health into the conversation of climate change, so that they make policies that involve women, because that's the only way that we'll achieve climate justice.
Yeah.
Agreed. Yes, I totally think that we need to implement something that is gonna make the climate crisis and reproductive justice one, because I mean, in order to succeed things, we know that women have to be at the hand of it. We take care of things, and in order to take care of things, we need to be okay in order to do those things. And if that is at stake, we're gonna continue the way we're going.
We often talk a lot about how women don't live their lives in silos. And so what feels like forced segmentation of issues is just not the reality to women's lives, whether it's climate change or economic opportunity or education and health and wellness. Are there any other projects that are going on in your organizations or in your countries that are trying to center some of this work, or people, leaders that we should follow? We're so lucky to have you all here today, but wanted to think about who's not on stage that should be, or other folks that are doing really important work.
I can think of a partner, one of our partners. They've been a partner and now, and not a partner, and now they're a partner again, the Coalition on Violence Against Women. And several years ago, we supported a project that was addressing the cultural issues that push girls into early marriage, and that also predisposed girls to issues of female genital mutilation that really go to the issues of bodily autonomy. And going to the root of that culture, the communities that were working in those areas were basically communities that live in the arid and semi-arid lands of Kenya that have extreme weather, and where they have a lot of deforestation, and suffer the consequences of climate change. And so poverty levels are extremely high. And so women, to address the poverty issues, would give out their girls through a culture that was called beading, where the girls would be given out to the male community, the male members of the community, for sexual, it was basically a form of sex trafficking that was being perpetuated by the mothers of these girls, and it was a culturally accepted practice. But if you go to the root cause of this practice, it sits with the fact that this community is in an arid, a semi-arid land, and there are very high levels of poverty. Looking for water predisposed the girls to a lot of violent attacks, because they'd go for long periods of time looking for water or taking care of the pasture in the land. So the connection between climate change and reproductive health, bodily autonomy, sits right there. And so we worked with this community, and they're able to create awareness, because one of the consequences, how we came in as Planned Parenthood, is that when the girls would become pregnant, they would be forced to have abortions, and they would do these abortions culturally, where they would basically rip the fetus out of the girl's womb. and this was an accepted practice. And so a lot of the girls died. Even if they survived this crude procedure, they would bleed to death, but a lot of them died during the process. And that's how we came in to work with this community. And so we truly need to make the link and have the intersection between climate change. A lot of times it looks like it's very far-fetched, but the reality sits right there, and there's evidence to show the connection.
Vanessa, so much of your work has been talking about making sure young women, young people, and especially young women from Africa are a part of this conversation. Are there folks who you work with, look up to, that you would suggest others should follow and learn more about?
Yeah, maybe fellow activists who are doing maybe the same work that I do. I know of Malaika and Esther. I know them from social media. They're really pushing for. They've been pushing for free pads for girls and for women, because not every girl has access to those menstrual facilities because of how expensive they can be, getting them every month. So I think they're really amazing, trying as much as possible to ask the first lady of the country to provide free menstruation facilities for girls in school and for women in their different households. And maybe I would also talk about she's called Miss Winnie Byanyima. She's a wife to Dr. Kiza Besige, and she's really doing incredible work of ensuring gender equality and protecting the rights of women. Yeah.
Leah, anyone?
There's so many, but the ones that come to mind is the Changing Women's Initiative. Nicole Gonzalez in New Mexico, she's a midwife who's trying to open a birthing center on one of the Pueblo's lands. And she also is working for, or working alongside us, I should say, and a few other women are a part of this collective that also work for reproductive care, as well as Ashley Sarcino with Native Women's Fire. She is amazing. She's probably one of the coolest cats in town. She also continuously works for women's rights, whatever it may be. But I know from my experience, she's actually from my village. She's a part of my family. We have had conversations about how to get this movement going and continuously having it going, getting our nieces and nephews involved, family members, elders, anybody who's willing to fight the fight with us.
Okay, we're going to move to questions in a minute, but last question for everyone here. So imagine a world where women are driving the conversation, where public policies are centered around women and their families, where women are empowered and in control. What would that look like in your communities to see that realized? What would that, if you could imagine that world, which feels hard to do sometimes, what would that look like? You can each take a turn, yeah.
Well, it's a difficult world to imagine, but I think it's a world that we must invariably imagine for us to, it's what should keep us motivated to keep moving, because I think that world is a reality, is a possibility. And there are some very good lessons that have come out and some success stories that have come out of the work, even though there's still a lot of work to be done. The example that I gave of the beading story, my last intervention, I think is a success story. This is a culture that has been there for a very, very long time. And the fact that the beading culture is now being challenged has meant that girls are able to go to school, because they're no longer being pawned to these young men in the communities. So they're able to go to school and they're able to see that another world is different, is possible, and they're able to make decisions and improve the economic welfare of their communities. So even though it looks like it's something that will take a long time to come, I think we must tackle it one step at a time, pause and celebrate each success as it comes, and build on it as we move along. And so I think I want to just ride on the example of Winnie Byanyima, who, apart from being Kizza Besigye's wife, I think she should be more recognized for her role in the women's movement and what she's doing with UNAIDS. And if we have women like Winnie Byanyima to look up to, Nyaradzi Ngumbonzvanda, who's working to end child marriage in Africa, then I think we've got a lot to look up to and a lot to look forward to. So that new world, that other world is possible.
Vanessa?
I think that before we had Facebook or Instagram, the person who created them first imagined. So I believe that if we imagine that future that we want, we can be able to achieve it, because it's first a vision and then it becomes a manifestation. So if we look forward to the kind of future that we want, probably a peaceful future or a healthy future for every girl child, for every woman, then I believe that we can achieve it. We just have to work towards it and keep doing what we are doing. Yeah.
Leah?
I also agree. So speaking it into existence, I believe we totally have the tools and the education to make that a reality. And I just think the work has to continue, and finding more people to help us fight the fight again. And I think one day it would be reality.
So I think we're going to pause here and turn to questions. I'm sure you all have a lot. And so I think there was a mic moving. So just if you want to raise your hand, and just a pleasant reminder that we're looking for questions, direct questions, not statements. And if you can just share your name and if you're with an organization, the organization you're with. Any questions? No, Vanessa, if you want to take that.
Yeah, just to say something about that, I don't think we have 10 years. I think the fact that people are already dying as a result of climate change, that means we already lost time. I don't think we have any time left. We lost it way back when people started dying. So we just have to keep pushing to try and redeem that time that we already lost, and try and save the victims, try and provide justice for those who lost their lives, try and fight for those who are here right now and for those who are coming in the future.
Questions? Yeah. I know this isn't a shy group, so I know many of you.
Hi, my name is Margaret Cooney, and I actually work here at Center for American Progress. I'm on the Oceans team, and I know you said you wanted straight-up questions. I'm going to ask it on behalf of my 11-year-old daughter, who's a big fan of Vanessa's. Very inspired by her work and the work of other young activists around the world. And she is always inspired by you all for how young you are and how much you've accomplished. And her question is basically, how do I do that as well? And so I'm looking at Vanessa. You told us a bit on how you got started, but how would you talk to people who are even younger than you and what they can do right now to move things forward?
Great question.
Yeah, I think before I would tell the younger people to start from scratch like I did, but right now I wouldn't say something like that because we have very many movements that have risen up like in different parts of the world, in different countries. So the key is getting into those movements with the help of the parents. They'll be able to adapt and demand for climate action in a way that is more friendly to them, because I wouldn't tell an 11-year-old to start from scratch. It would really be crazy. But there are very many movements. I think Fridays for Future is almost in every country right now. So it's up to you, the parent, to help them get in and to support them, to be with them during those strikes, because it can be quite scary, especially if you're an 11-year-old. So all you have to do is be there, support them, and yeah. Thank you.
Yes. And I know we wanted to bring you in, so.
Hi, my name is Nelly Mnyasia from Kenya. My question goes to Vanessa. And thank you so much for the amazing work you're doing on climate change. But one of the issues that has just come up very well is that we cannot deassociate climate change and sexual and reproductive health rights, especially among girls and women. So, and we believe there's power in young people, and young people have a way of helping us realize results very fast. So to you, Vanessa, what strategies do you have in place to quickly merge the two? Because the more you work on climate only, then that means it's going to take us long to realize results. So what are the strategies that you quickly have that are going to merge the two for us to be speaking to each other instead of doing two amazing work separately? Thank you.
Yeah, I think the best strategy I could give is education. Personally, I didn't know the link between reproductive health and climate change until I received an invitation and I decided to read about it and to understand how they are really connected. And that's something I didn't know. And there are very many young people, they may not get invitations, so they won't really be pushed to read about these things and understand. But I believe that if you extend the education to them, for example, in schools or in the organizations that work directly with these young people, so you can extend those services through those organizations or through schools directly or through social media, because young people use social media a lot to try and educate them, because we cannot push for these things if we don't know. So we have to be taught, we have to be given the information so that we can work together to try and join the issue of sexual and reproductive health plus climate change.
We have a new ambassador for all of our reproductive health rights and justice issues. One in the back and then in the front,
yeah. Jasmine Huggins from Church World Service. Thanks very much to a great panel. I want to particularly thank Carol for her work. I think you're ahead of your time in many respects. I work full-time on climate change, and I think it's quite a struggle to get it's quite a struggle to get women's issues on the agenda, let alone reproductive rights within the climate arena. So, so thank you for your work. Two questions. You say you're optimistic. I don't know if I completely share that optimism, but I would like to. So could you say a little bit more about to what extent governments are beginning to see reproductive rights and reproductive health as a public health issue as opposed to a marginal women's issue? And are churches doing, are they being helpful? Do you see any optimism for churches beginning to see reproductive health as a public health issue rather than a moral issue? And can we expect the kind of change that we saw with HIV, for example, where they started seeing HIV as moral and then they started seeing it as public health? But that took a long time. Do you have any optimism in terms of government and churches? And second, can you say a little bit more about working with boys and men in this arena? Thank you so much.
Thanks for your question and thanks for the kind compliment. I think to remain optimistic. The reality looks grim, and I think it's Vanessa who said Facebook was started with a vision and a dream, and I think that must be our point of departure, because if we fail to see the optimism, then we're not going to challenge the status quo, because I think it's by activating our optimism that we begin to challenge the grim reality. In terms of government seeing reproductive health as a public health issue, maybe they don't, but again, that takes me to my previous comment. When we go with the optimism, then we begin to change their mind. The experience we've had in Kenya is that a lot of the government officials and the technocrats who ultimately inform the political aspect of the policy making process are not as informed as we think they are. And so one of the things that we do is to inform them, to give them information. And again, I will mention Nelly. I'll keep mentioning Nelly because she's doing an amazing job with her organization. And one of the things that she has put together is a task force or a technical working group whose main purpose is to inform the Ministry of Health, to give them information so that they're not working from a point of ignorance. And that brings in the issue of the faith-based organizations. It's biblical that the Bible says, my people perish for lack of knowledge. So our churches are perishing because of lack of knowledge. The people who are dying from unsafe abortions are people who go to churches, who belong to faith communities. Kenya, for example, is 80% Christian. The rate of women dying from unsafe abortions comes from that 80% Christian. So they have to be informed. And one of the ways of informing them is by including faith-based organizations in the discussions, by including them in the conversations, so that they're also going back to their congregations who are the beneficiaries of the policies from a point of knowledge. And again, churches also, if you look at where the points of departure are with a lot of the faith-based organizations, oftentimes it's an issue of semantics. So, for example, the issue of sexuality education, the big problem with sexuality education in Kenya is the word C, the letter C, comprehensive. Churches are giving sexuality education. The only problem they have is how we name it. And so there's need to include church and faith-based organizations to the table so that they understand that we're all doing the same thing. Our ultimate goal is to stop women from dying, to stop girls from having unwanted or rather early pregnancies, to stop girls from being exposed to sexual violence such as rape, to stop early marriages. Churches want the same things because they're made up of the 80% who make up the Kenyan population. So I think that's a long answer. The short answer is inclusion. We must be inclusive in our conversations, in our strategies, and in our initiatives.
Thank you. We have time for one last question. I think we had one in the front.
Thank you. My name is Kenyora with End Rape on Campus. And my question specifically is centered on sexual violence space, particularly for us. We work with college students who, you know, as we know, for women of color and Black women especially, underreporting for sexual violence is at a disproportionate rate. And so what I would love to know from all three of you, if you can speak to this, is centrally, what are the challenges that you're facing when it comes to the sexual violence piece that is affected by climate change? And like, what are the challenges that you're facing within that space, and what are you doing to combat or, you know, provide prevention or intervention methods to help women of color?
Well, in Native communities, sexual violence is probably one of the very well-known issues in our communities. And I know in a lot of the reservations in New Mexico, we have uranium mines, we have oil companies that bring outsiders into our lands, which ties into the missing and murdered Indigenous women. The reason a lot of our rates aren't shown in today's statistics is because when an intruder or a perpetrator is on our lands and rapes or sexually abuses a woman of the community, we can't persecute them on our land because of our own governance system. So with that, a lot of these people get away, and we, in the end, lose our women. And to this day, we still are having this issue. And a lot of women are still missing for numerous years. And I think there's also a very recent case of 12 women being found at the top of a mesa that were missing 10 years ago. And it was at or around the area of the oil companies. And I think right now the solution to that, or what we're trying to do, is make it more aware, teach our girls and women self-defense classes, because as we want them to be in your shoes and everybody else's shoes one day, to leave home, get an education, and speak about issues like this, we also have to, unfortunately, teach them how to move because of the rates, because of companies like that, or just people in general.
Earlier, Vanessa, if you want to add in, I know you talked in terms of water, for example, and young women having to travel long distances and unsafe conditions to get some basic necessities like water. If there's any programs there. Or
what I can add is the challenges of sexual violence that arise from the consequences of climate change. Because what happens is when there's a consequence such as flooding, then a humanitarian situation is created. And so there's a lot of sexual violence that happens in the holding areas, or we've heard of cases of sex for food, so that aid workers are then the ones who are who end up victimizing the women who need that help. The other challenge around sexual violence is that where there are cases of rape and these incidences are reported, the police don't know what to do because they're dealing with the humanitarian crisis. It's the bigger problem. And so one of our partners, called Kellen, has been working with training the police and the law enforcement officers to know how to respond in such situations, so that even if there's a bigger crisis, such as a conflict like Kenya had several years back, or there's a flood, then you still are able to address the conflict, but also have space to address the personal issues that affect those affected by the conflict, such as the rape, know where to refer them, rather than focusing on the bigger problem, which is the humanitarian crisis. And so part of what we're trying to do is also partner with organizations that are working around humanitarian crisis, such as the Kenya Red Cross. And during the ICPD 25, we partnered around project, a panel, where we came up with proposals that they're taking forward, because they're working directly on some of these climate change issues, on how to respond to sexual and gender-based violence in cases of humanitarian crisis. So that's what we try and do, information and partnership.
Anything to add, Vanessa?
I think there is a challenge in that, and that's the fact that these women see, I'll talk about the humanitarian services that come in after climate disasters. So these women see these people as heroes in this, in this story. So in case of any kind of sexual violence, like sex for food, like you've said, or sex for shelter, these women don't even have the courage to report these cases because they're seeing these people as heroes who have come to help them out. So just maybe giving them a night, or maybe their daughter, they don't see it as a very big challenge because they see that these people are coming in as heroes for them, providing them the help that they need. So I think we really need to teach these women so that they understand that if these humanitarian services come, they are free of charge and they don't have to give in anything. And in case they are forced by the workers to, give themselves in or to give their daughters, then they have opportunities to report these cases. And also even these humanitarian workers, they need to have authorities that these people can report to, because if those things can happen to women or to children, that means there is no way that there is no one they can report to in case of such challenges. And most of the women think that these people are helping them out. I mean, why would I give in someone who is trying to help me? So the key is to let them know that these services are free of charge, and in case anyone tries to ask for anything in return, then they have someone that they can report to.
Thank you. I think as we all can hear and feel from today's conversation, these issues are complicated and, layer in historical colonization and oppression and, from all the different intersectional oppressions that we face. But let's take a moment to celebrate our guests that we have today and to really thank you for coming from very far places and for joining us in today's talk. Thank you, and thank you. You're a great audience.